Here is a psychological truth that most men spend their entire lives avoiding. You do not suffer because you are weak. You suffer because you were conditioned to avoid everything that would have made you strong. Your brain learned, silently and gradually, to seek comfort, to avoid friction, to interpret resistance as a signal that something is wrong rather than a signal that something is being built. And this creates an invisible prison, because the man who avoids discomfort does not realize that by protecting himself from pain, he is also protecting himself from his own growth. There is a reason why so many men today feel a constant restlessness, a difficult-to-name sensation that something is out of place, even when their lives appear stable on the surface. That sensation is not a lack of opportunity, it is not a lack of intelligence, and it is not a lack of potential. It is a lack of formation. It is the result of a mind that was never trained to carry the weight of its own decisions. And if you want to understand why this affects your confidence, your discipline, and your very identity, then you need to stay here until the end. And if you recognize that this kind of formation is rare and necessary in the modern world, like this video and subscribe to the channel, because this is not a space for entertainment, it is a space for psychological reconstruction. During the Middle Ages, a boy did not become a man simply through the passage of time. Time, by itself, had no power to form anyone. What formed a man was deliberate friction with reality. Ruth Mazo-Karas describes that medieval masculine formation involved a clear rupture from the comfort of childhood. The boy was removed from constant protection and inserted into a structure where his decisions had real consequences, where his word needed to carry weight, where his presence needed to carry responsibility. He became a squire not merely to learn techniques of combat, but to learn something far deeper, to learn to endure himself. He woke before dawn not because he was motivated, but because it was expected. He continued training when he was exhausted not because he wanted to, but because it was necessary. And slowly, his brain learned something that almost no one learns today. That action does not depend on emotion. That execution does not depend on mood. That a decision is not a suggestion negotiated with temporary feelings, but an order that must be obeyed by the man who gave it. The modern man, by contrast, was conditioned to live in a permanent state of internal negotiation. He decides something but retreats when resistance appears. He begins something but abandons it when enthusiasm disappears. He promises something to himself, but breaks that promise without realizing the devastating psychological effect of doing so. Because every time you break a decision you made in a moment of clarity, your mind learns something dangerous. It learns that you are not a reliable authority. And when your own mind stops trusting you, your identity begins to fracture. You begin to feel doubt. Not because you lack capability, but because you lack accumulated evidence of execution. You begin to hesitate, not because the world is harder, but because your mind was never trained to operate under resistance. And this creates an invisible cycle where a man spends his life waiting to feel ready, without realizing that he will never feel ready, because readiness is not an emotional state. Readiness is a consequence of repetition under pressure. But this is where the part begins that most people avoid understanding, and it is precisely why they remain trapped in the same place for years. The human brain is an adaptation machine. It does not adapt to what you desire. It adapts to what you repeat. If you repeat avoidance, it becomes efficient at avoidance. If you repeat execution, it becomes efficient at execution. Geoffroy de Charny, one of the most respected knights of his time, wrote that honor was not built in grand moments, but in the invisible consistency of maintaining one's conduct regardless of circumstances. Because he understood something that modern psychology confirms today. The brain builds identity through evidence, not intention. You do not become strong by wishing to be strong. You become strong by proving, repeatedly, that you execute despite resistance. Every time you act despite discomfort, your brain records evidence that you are someone who does not retreat. And every time you retreat, it records evidence that you are someone who does. There is a silent psychological phenomenon that shapes a man's destiny without him realizing it. Every time you avoid something difficult, you feel immediate relief. That relief is rewarding. It teaches your brain that avoidance is safe, that avoidance is effective, that avoidance works. And slowly, your nervous system becomes conditioned to choose the path of least resistance automatically. This seems harmless at first. It feels like comfort. But over time, it reduces your tolerance for discomfort. And when your tolerance for discomfort decreases, your capacity for action decreases. And when your capacity for action decreases, your confidence decreases. And when your confidence decreases, your identity weakens. Not because you were born weak, but because you trained your mind to remain weak. The medieval knight lived under a completely different psychological structure. Ramon Lull wrote that a knight must first govern himself before he could govern anything else. This meant learning to act independently of fear, independently of doubt, independently of emotional fluctuation. Not because he did not feel those things, but because he was not governed by them. And this created a psychological stability that was almost impossible to break. He did not need to feel confident in order to act, because his identity was not dependent on temporary emotional states. His identity was dependent on accumulated evidence of execution. He knew he would execute because he always executed, and that internal predictability is the foundation of real confidence. Not confidence based on words, but confidence based on proof. And here is the truth that may be difficult to accept, but explains more than almost anything else why so many men today feel lost. You did not lose your strength. You were never placed in an environment that required you to build it. The modern world removed almost every natural mechanism of formation. It removed the necessity to endure. It removed the necessity to persist. It removed the necessity to become stable under pressure. And without that pressure, the nervous system remains untrained, unadapted, unformed. The result is a man who depends on motivation to act, depends on inspiration to persist, depends on favorable emotional states to execute. And this creates constant instability, because emotional states are, by nature, unstable. But there is a breaking point. There is a moment when a man begins to act despite resistance. And that moment changes everything. Because the first time you execute something difficult without negotiating with your own mind, you create a fracture in the old pattern. The second time, that fracture widens. The third time, something begins to reorganize. Your brain begins to update your self-image. It begins to recognize that you are no longer someone who retreats automatically. And over time, this new evidence accumulates until a new identity forms. An identity based on execution, an identity based on stability, an identity based on internal authority. If you have reached this point, then you already perceive something that most never perceive. You see that character is not an abstract trait. Character is a neurological pattern built through repetition. It is the reduction of the distance between decision and action. It is the elimination of the habit of negotiating with temporary impulses. And this is exactly why few men develop true character. Because few men are willing to execute when there is no immediate reward, no recognition, no external validation. But it is precisely in those invisible moments that character is formed. And in the end, this is the difference that separated the knight from the common man, and that still separates the formed man from the unformed man today. The knight was not invincible. He felt fear. He felt doubt. He felt pain. But he was not governed by those things. He had trained his mind to obey his decision, not his emotions. And that possibility still exists today. Not because the world demands it, but because the man who builds this becomes someone who no longer depends on the world to remain stable. If this video made you realize something you had never seen before, like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment, and share it with other men who also need to rebuild their minds. Because in the end, character is not given. It is built. And the man who builds it becomes someone who does not need to say he is strong. His very presence proves it.